Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Ann Burkett, and I am a reference archivist in the research room here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Thank you for joining me for today's research rundown. Today, we're going to be focusing on how to use city directories as a resource in genealogical research. This discussion is going to focus on African Americans and city directories, so let's get started. Most of you, if not all of you, are probably familiar with city directories. They can be a guide to the past by helping you make connections to neighborhoods, cities, and individuals. You can make neighborhood connections and trace historic activity through street names or businesses. Directories can be a key to seeing changes in an area over time. These are great resources for researching structures or companies. You can also determine where a community was at a given time or when it may have come into an existence. It can also help you determine who is in the community at a given time. Where can you find city directories? There are many resources out there where you can access city directories, and we'll discuss a few of these. Throughout this presentation, though, I have used mainly Ancestry.com and only Alabama city directories. So remember that there's plenty else out there besides what I'm going to show you. State and local archives and public libraries can be great resources for city directories, and the best way to figure out how to access those and what are available is to just contact the institution. They'll be able to walk you through over the phone or whatever their situation is. We do that all the time here. Another place is Google Books. It's another resource. It's fairly easy to use and it's free. There are some Alabama directories available on Google Books along with other types. However, I did find that some of them they're not as easy, can be a little confusing, but it was pretty straightforward overall. This resource also gives you options of letting you know if an item is not fully online, and if so, it will show you where you can purchase it or how you can get it, which to me was one of the better parts of that resource. Hathi Trust is another resource. It's free and pretty easy to use. I was not able to find many Alabama directories there, but there definitely are for other places. Internet Archives is another free and easy to use resource, and it had some older Alabama directories there. Ancestry.com is a resource that really has a very, very large collection of directories, and it is probably one of the easier to use. Now, that could be that I'm most familiar with using it, and that's why it's easiest to me, but it's very searchable, and you can also flip through. It's also just easy to select what you want, to narrow it down by state and place. That's very simple as well on Ancestry. This collection consists, most of them end around the 1960s, but some do go even farther into the 1990s. As far as I can tell, most of Alabama's on their end in the 1960s. However, Ancestry does cost money. It's one of the few that you will have to pay to look at these directories. So I always tell people, if that's not something that you can do or want to do, go to your local archive or library and see if they have an Ancestry subscription there and you can use it there. Another resource is FamilySearch.org. It's free. It's not as user friendly, so it's not something that I always like to go to, but it is free. Don's List is another one, but it was not very easy to use, and it did not have any Alabama directories. Finally, there's a resource called the U.S. Online Historical Directories. The thing I liked about this one was that it basically lets you know where certain types of directories are. It's not really a resource for helping you actually find literal directories, but it will help you find where they are online. Next, let's talk about some of the basics. So, city directories have a broad spectrum for how they can be useful. They are great to use with other resources because you can kind of help fill in some of the gaps. So, if you can't find someone on a census, you may be able to find them on a city directory. You can also find the locations of businesses, sometimes even homes. City directories can be used to determine when someone may have moved to a city or maybe even left. The head of the household is usually listed, but it can be more than one person shown in a listing. But oftentimes it is going to be kind of the head of the household. City directories also can give users information about the city and can list businesses, churches, schools, and hospitals. They can commonly contain lists of city officials, police, firemen, state, and U.S. officials. The history of the area or state is also common in these resources. It is, in some cases, there can be photographs of the area or even maps. So, another important thing to remember when you're looking through city directories, African American individuals, businesses, schools, and churches often have certain designations in city directories. These usually are going to be an asterisk or a C for colored. On occasion, African Americans may be listed completely separately, and there even are directories that don't list any distinctions between races. Another important thing to remember about directories is that they're created by private publishers. The reason why this is important is this leads to variations in each publication and also coverage of location and content. Therefore, directories are not uniform. They can always vary and they usually will. So they're not all going to be the exact same. The Alabama Department of Archives and History has a large collection of city directories. We have a collection of all of the cities that are listed here on microfilm and microfiche in our research room. So this listing is what we have on microfilm. As you can see, it's various different date ranges. You have Anniston, which goes from 1908 to 1960, whereas Andalusia, there's only 5 years, or 4 years, excuse me. So, but those are what we have on microfilm in the research room. But we have a much larger hard copy collection that contains roughly 242 boxes. These date ranges are from about 1837 to 2007, and this hardbound collection is a much wider variety than what is available on Ancestry.com and even in our microfilm collection. While city directories are mostly just cities, some of these do include larger areas, such as entire counties, metropolitan areas, or even multiple towns. Some of these examples include you can have Escambia County, Shelby County, St. Clair County. I know those are some of the counties we have represented. Some of the cities that are kind of meshed together, you have Greenville and Fort Deposit, Florence and the Shoals region, Enterprise and Ozark. Those are just some examples. Those are not the only ones, but those were just some of the examples I found to kind of show y'all. So now that we have covered what city directories are, where to find them, and what is available in them, let's talk about how we could use them. So first, I want to state again that these are city directories. So if you're like me and most of your ancestors are from rural areas, many of these may not be the best resource for you. Since my ancestors are from out in the country, they are not going to be found on a city directory. So make sure when you start the process that you know what area is being covered. Check the directory for any additions or late entries. Learn the abbreviations because that is important to understanding what information the city directory is giving you. Examine the table of contents so that you can navigate the resource easier. And don't forget about the advertisements if you're looking for a business or you just want to learn more about the area in general. So the abbreviations page is what I would start with if you're not familiar with the resource. It's a page that I still use quite often. Many of these abbreviations are common and easy to understand, but some can be quite tricky. And you need to make sure that you can go back and refer, because some of these are obsolete, they're out of date. Not terms that we use today. So make sure that you can always refer back to that abbreviations page. It's also interesting to see kind of how these abbreviation pages change over time. So in this example, this is from the Huntsville City Directory from 1908, and you can see the abbreviations here. And then I'm going to show you one on the next slide. This is an abbreviation page from the Andalusia City Directory from 1955. So you can see how many more words were added between the two. This is also a great example of how different directories can look so very different from each other. So they really can change a lot. And a lot have changed in those 40, 50 years. So let's talk about the table of contents. So most directories have a similar page to this one. They are often called an index, but they can also be called contents, table of contents. Here you can see two examples. I know they're probably small on your screen, but don't worry about the wording. I really just want you to see that they look very, very different, but yet they're the same, essentially the same content. So here you can see one, it's from 1878. It's the Mobile directory. They just use the term contents, and they also have an index to advertisements. The next one is one from Decatur that has 1942. It's from 1942, and it uses the term general index. So while these pages may not look important, they're very, very important for navigating. This is something that I use all the time when I'm using these directories, because since they're all so different, where they place particular parts of the directory are always different. So you can't always rely on the fact that the advertisements are in the front or the middle or the back, or that the businesses are listed here, or that the individuals or the street guide. It's all going to be different. So you always refer back to this index or contents page to see where you should look for whatever question you're trying to answer. So let's talk a little bit about street guides. So city directories can give you information about the boundaries of the town or city. They will sometimes include maps, but most of the time they include what they call street guides. These are essentially a typed guide into which streets connect to which, and this helps you determine where a city was at the time. There are two examples here. I've got one from Mobile, from Mobile in 1869, and it is giving out the boundaries of the city wards. So you could essentially take this information and make your own boundary to see where the city was at that time in 1869. The other example is from basically the beginning page of the street guide from the Montgomery City Directory in 1904. And here you can see kind of how it has the streets listed out, and it shows even some people's names and kind of where those streets intersect. So it's kind of like a backwards, it's kind of like a backwards directory. So instead of knowing a person's name and looking for them, you just find a street. So let's talk about advertisements and businesses. So not everybody's always looking for people in the directory. Sometimes people are trying to look up a business or look up a school. So we're going to focus on this for a moment. City directories have yellow pages for the businesses in the area, and these are listed alphabetically by category or type. This can include the address and, in some later editions, the telephone number. Sometimes it can also give the name of a business owner. Here's an example of a classified business directory for the 1960 Montgomery City Directory. And don't forget that also this listing of businesses, there can be advertisements that are more than just businesses. So you can see here in the other example that I have is Knox Academy, which is an African-American school in Selma. So, and it's most of the time for advertisements, you do see mostly businesses, but every now and then you will see something that's not strictly a business. So this was a pretty cool example I found. I hate that this little copyright deposit stickers there, so you can't see the picture of the school, but it gives you a good example of how some advertisements are. This one took up an entire page, and some may only take up a quarter of the page or a third, but this one took up an entire page. So, how do we find some businesses that African Americans started? So, some directories will offer a distinction between African American businesses and those that were started by white people. That will often be advertised in some way in the directory. However, not all of them do this. A great example is the Selma City Directory from 1913. It places an asterisk beside African American business owners. So if you look at this page, you can see here the businesses that are listing them in alphabetical order. It's got cotton wares, dairies, dentists, department stores, dressmakers. You can see there that there are 2 African American dentists, 2 African American dressmakers, and 1 drug retail store that is African American owned. So I wanted to make sure that I was right on my hunch that these asterisks indicated the race of these business owners. So I then looked them up in the individual listing. And if you see my arrow here, it's pointing from this L.M. Pollard, who's a dentist. And I found his entry in the individual section under Lorenzo M. Pollard, dentist, at 1022 and a half Broad. And his house is on 18 Lapsley. So as I looked down, I saw there were other Pollards listed, and there's another Pollard, a Robert T. Pollard, who is a minister, and he lives on the same street as Dr. Pollard, which I thought was pretty interesting. But I had no indication that they had any connection, but I thought that was pretty interesting. But this is how you can find a business owner and then connect that to a person in the directory. Okay, you can also find churches. Typically, these give you denomination, address, name of church, and pastor. I have a listing here of all the African American churches in Selma in 1913. Some of these are still around today. You can see this picture here is of Brown's Chapel AME, which is still there. This is a more recent picture, obviously, but if you look, it is right there. It's the second listing under Methodist churches. It's at 406 Sylvan, and the Reverend was J.W. Walker at the time. So that's pretty cool to see a church that was in a 1913 directory, and here's a picture of it today. So those are just some of the connections you can make. All right, so city directories can also be a great resource for finding public, private, and religious schools in a community, and even trade schools or colleges. The Montgomery 1904 city directory image, which should be the first one on the page, shows you how schools will be separated in the directories into white and African American schools. You can see how it even has private and public separations too. I bet you will recognize some of those names. The one in the middle is an advertisement from the 1913 city directory in Selma for Selma University. And then the third image are the African American schools in 1925 in Montgomery. So, and you can also see some familiar names there as well. But this gives you a good indication of how they're divided. It can be that they're divided in a category that may say colored or African American, or it may just have an asterisk, like those business owners in the slide previously. So let's talk about some kind of things you can find out about the local area. So one of my favorite things about city directories are the information they provide about the area itself. So, and they will really give you some detailed and in-depth information. These directories that I've listed here are some examples of that. Many of these were pages and pages long, so I just had to kind of find little snippets to kind of give you different looks at how they could be presented. So the Montgomery image gives you statistical information about the city in 1940. And then the middle image is of the city of Sheffield in the Florence City Directory. So that tells me that Sheffield, the people of Sheffield, it's too small to have their own city directory, but they're included in the Florence one. So if you have someone who is from Sheffield, maybe look in the next town over, like Florence. That one kind of gives you some information about how many schools and churches there are in the town, which is pretty interesting as well. The third image shows how the Bessemer City in 1932. It gives geographic information about the area, and it also these can be great sections to know more about what a place was like when an ancestor lived there. We have people who call all the time and want to know. I want to know what my great-great-grandfather's town was like. And sometimes this is some of the only ways that you can do that, or you can find out what a place may really been like at the time. Okay, social groups. One part of city directories that often get overlooked are social groups. One can find these fairly easily in the directory. You don't really get a listing of who's in the group as far as participants. So you can't really go about that route, but you can at least see sometimes who the president or maybe the founder or an important figure may be. But often they will give you obviously the name of the group, and then the address is very typical. But sometimes you can see in one example, there's only one African American social group in Selma in 1929. Got it underlined here in orange. And the other image is of the Birmingham City Directory, and you can see that under colored societies, it starts all of the social groups in Birmingham that are African American in 1916. And this went on for literally pages. So there are many, 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 many in that area. And you can even see in the Birmingham one that they tell you when they meet. Like that very first one, it says, well, of course, the first one doesn't, but the next one down, it says, meets every Wednesday night in Avondale. So you can even find out when they meet. So that's pretty interesting. Next, let's talk about how to find individuals. So you can find them, they're going to be listed alphabetically. The people that are present are usually the head of a household, spouses, or children that are over 18, or maybe another adult in the household. Just depends. This is a great possibility and alternative to census records because they're instead of, census is only every 10 years, and this is going to be every year, every other year, every couple years. So it gives you a little more frequency than this census. Also, don't forget to remember to look at your abbreviations page so you can see, find out what their occupation is or what the R means versus the H as far as residence and house. And any of those little tiny tips that you can find. This image here, I really thought was interesting. It's actually from a directory in Montgomery in 1960, and they're all of these that are similar to this. They're like tips, tricks, and they're just scattered throughout the directory for that particular one. And it is showing you how you can determine if someone is employed or married, and how you can see how they connect. So don't forget to look for those little things. Because they may be lurking in your directory to help you understand how to use it. So I wanted to give you an example of how to actually find someone. So if you remember, we talked about Dr. Lorenzo Pollard, who was a dentist in Selma, and I wanted to find out more about him. So I'm going to show you some steps that I took to kind of expand on who he was. So if you'll look here, we've got the same image from an earlier slide. He's a dentist. His business is on 1022 and a half Broad, and he lives at 18 Laplasley. So And we also had the Reverend Robert T. Pollard, who I thought it was interesting that they are the same race and the same surname and living on the same street. Not in the same house, but they live on the same street. So I did some digging and I looked at census records and some other records, World War I draft card and Find a Grave. And I was able to make some connections and find out more about Dr. Pollard. So I started first with census records. And the first one I found was a 1900 census, and I've posted it here. I found Dr. Pollard at the time. He was not a doctor. He is around 10 years old, and he is living with an RT and an EW Pollard in Barber County. And RT is listed as his father, and he is a minister. So that kind of starts to build a connection between the two Pollard men living on Laplaslie. But I still want to do more digging. So I found a 1910 census in Dallas County, and Lorenzo is there, and he's listed as a student. And I didn't place that image on this slide because it was very illegible and it was too hard to read, and I didn't want to show that one if it was not legible. So that's why I chose to show the earlier one. But it's a better example as far as the information it gave, because this person is a student. He is now living in, he wasn't living in the city of Selma, but he was living on the outskirts. So it's getting him closer to where we know he is in 1913. And Reverend Robert T. Pollard is there, and he's in the household, and he is listed as his father. So that helped me connect those two men together as well. So I went on to find Dr. Pollard's World War I draft card, and it lists his full name, Lorenzo Marquis Pollard, and he is living in Florence and is a dentist. And I've circled some of the important parts of that card that kind of helped uh, mold it all together for my research. And I went on to find his Find a Grave, and Dr. Pollard went on to move to Ohio, and that is where he lived until his death in 1950. So this is just an example of how you can use all of these things, and then take other records, combine it all. And that whole search, all the information started with me just finding a random name in the business section. So you can do a lot with city directories if you know how to. So that is we're going to wrap up now. So before we get to our questions portion, I want to add that the Alabama Department of Archives and History is still closed to the public right now, and we are only accepting research appointments for those viewing state agency records or manuscripts. And I also want to ask you all to please, please, please answer our research rundown survey. It's going to be linked in the chat box, so you can find it there. But please answer it so we'll know, if y'all like these research rundowns. Are we doing a good job? What can we do better at? What are we doing right? So please answer it if you have a few minutes. But now we've come to the end. Does anyone have any questions? So we've got a question here. Do the directories have information about local government, such as officials and wards or precinct? Yes, they do. So they usually, it can be at the beginning, could be at the end, just depending on the directory. But they'll even list state and federal officials, so senators or representatives, and they'll often do local government as well. So anything down from the mayor to the city council members. So that's something you can usually definitely find. The wards usually are in there as well. It just really depends on what the city describes them as, but in like Mobile, the ward description is pretty easy to find in places like New Orleans, even here in Montgomery. But a lot of that is there. Okay, I see a question here that says, "My ancestors lived in Hayneville. Will they be in Montgomery?" Um, they could be, but most likely not. I would have to look at the Montgomery ones to see how broad they go out, but most likely they're probably not going to be included in those. I see another one. Let's see. I was told a few years ago. So, yes, I believe that is true, but, I could be wrong, but yes, I believe that's true just from they'd have to go about collecting the information and then publishing it, and some of these are really old. So I would think that for the ones from, like, 2007, that could be less the case, but from the ones from the 1920s and 30s, that is probably pretty close to the case. I would think that is true, but I don't know for a fact, but I would agree with that just from the process of all the steps that would have had to go into actually making these materials. Um, I see another question, that says, "Where can I find relatives that lived in a rural area like Macon County?" Um, Oftentimes, like I said in the presentation, my relatives are from a rural area, so it often is hard to find them sometimes. Um, so, but usually I have to start with the census and then look in county records to see if they maybe if there's any tax records or if they got married. That's kind of the big thing that really stinks is that these city directories are so great, but they're only for people who live in cities. And so for a lot of people, like me and you, who our family lived out in the country, there's not a lot to bridge those gaps. We often only have those census records and then county records and things like that. So oftentimes when you get closer into modern times, you can look in like a telephone directory, but those aren't really going to be available for the 20s and 30s and 40s. That's going to be way more recent into the 70s and 80s. I see another question here that says, "What archival African American resources are digitized for online review?" Um, do you mean just so I understand your question, do you mean, for you to actually view and use? Or, like, some people, like to do, like, crowdsourcing indexing. Do you mean that kinda reviewing or just for you to use in your research? If it's to use in your research, if you're looking for online digitized African American, content, there are some really great stuff out there, besides the city directories. You have the Freedmen's Bureau, those are on familysearch.org. There's also we've got an 1867 and an 18 believe it's 75 voter registrations on our website that are digitized, and those are really great because that 1867 one is only 2 years after the end of slavery. So, um, some Black men were able to register to vote, and you'll be able to see, oh my gosh, here are these men. It could be, you may recognize the name, you may not, but you may be able to find surnames that you know in certain counties. And that can be a great tool 'cause it's only 2 years after the end of slavery. Those are just some of the ones that come to mind, but there are plenty, plenty out there. Okay, any more questions? I see you said voting and tax. The voting records, the 1867 ones, um, those are gonna be online. I don't personally know of any online Alabama tax records, um, but I know some states do have them online, but I don't know of any that we do. Okay, here's a question. How can I determine the boundaries of the districts and precincts in 1867? So, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of those, there should be, I'd have to do some digging on that. Um, there should be a maps where you can kind of piece those together. But oftentimes we find, like, for example, people ask all the time about, I want to know what precinct this is in the 1920 US Census. And sometimes that information, we have no idea. Sometimes we do have records that we can pull and kind of piece it together and figure out, but, sometimes it's lost to time, but it just takes some digging. It might be out there, it might not. Um, okay. Oh, for anybody who does wanna contact the archives or contact me, you can email me. I can put my email, well, I can I can see if we can post it to the chat. Okay. All right. So we got my email posted to the chat. So anybody that wants to email me any questions, they can be about this or they can be about something else. That's totally fine. And if I don't know the answer, I'll either find out or I will send you to the person who does. So feel free to email me. I think we're gonna have to wrap up pretty soon. So, I think we're gonna have to start wrapping up because I'm over my time. But, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to email me. Um, my email, like I said, is in the chat box. Also, if you would rather talk on the phone, you can call. Our numbers are listed on our website. So please feel free to call or email. It was wonderful getting to talk to y'all. I hope that y'all enjoy this. Please don't forget to do the survey so we'll know if you guys like these research rundowns. So, but thank y'all so much for helping, and it was great to see everybody.